specialist. Would you say when? Sorry. Talk amongst. Oh, now we're live? Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to B Street. This is the second week. We have Eric here from Moab. Round of applause. He's from Ogden. Born and raised. Dog food and I don't know what else used to happen in Ogden back in the day besides dog food smell and skiing, I guess, mountaineering. But he's going to talk about Moab. He's the forecaster for the UAC in Moab. He's going to talk about the 92 accident and then just in general skiing in Moab. So pass it off to you, Eric. You're all go.
Wow. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for having me. This is a cool crowd. It's a good turnout. I like your scene up here a lot. And is that coming across all right?
That's me, yeah.
Okay. And I'm not a complete stranger to this area. As Corey said, I was actually born here in Ogden, and the very first place I ever had on skis was Nordic Valley. And and then I eventually skied at Powder Mountain. And eventually my family moved further south, and I grew up skiing Brighton. And then I spent 10 years up in Alta. My first dream job ever was flipping burgers at the Gold Miner's Daughter with a ski pass and skiing every single day. And then I got a job on the ski patrol, and that's where I got my avalanche experience there, was at Alta. I'm also an avalanche survivor. I got caught in an avalanche in Days Fork early on in my career when I was working at gold miners, and I never, ever want to have that happen to me again. And has anybody here ever been caught in an avalanche? It's not something you want to repeat, is it? No, but it does happen, and that's why it's really cool that you guys have your own local Ogden Avalanche Center up here, and I hope you also check the Utah Avalanche Center forecast, but you guys have a really nice, tight community up here, and that's really awesome. The way I got connected with Moab was I was a patroller and working at Alta, and then I was river guiding at Moab in the summertime, and there was this beautiful mountain range up there, and I was like, man, I want to get up there and ski that place someday. And just like most of you have seen this view. Everybody's been to Moab, right? Down there mountain biking or rock climbing or jeeping or doing whatever. And everybody kind of sees this view. And I kept looking up at these mountains and thinking, man, I want to ski in those mountains someday. And I was down there as a river guide, and I had finished up my season at Alta, and I had my skis with me. And so one day in June, I just drove all the way up to Geyser Pass, which is clear over here, actually. And then this, you can't see the north face of Mount Mellenthin, but I drove up the Geyser Pass and just looked around. I had no idea where I was even going or what I was doing, but I was like, hey, there's snow on that still. I think I'll go up and ski that. And I got pretty enamored of the LaSalle Mountains. And so that eventually led to my forecasting position down there. We've always been a little bit of an outlier as well, kind of like the Ogden scene up here, so I can really appreciate that. It was the LaSalle Avalanche Forecast Center for years and years and years. We're on the Manti-LaSalle National Forest. We weren't even an official part of the Utah Avalanche Center. There was definitely kind of a loose connection for many, many years. But in 2013, they really brought us on board, and it's actually been quite a good thing for us. So now I'm a part of the Utah Avalanche Center, but I'm still a Manti-LaSalle National Forest employee. And without further ado, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a overview of the LaSalle Mountains, talk about some of the accidents that we've happened down there, have had happen down there, show you some of the terrain, and talk a little bit about the snowpack. But everybody, I think, has seen the LaSalles from town, from the desert, and obviously we have some huge giant avalanche paths, but these are all west and southwest facing, and so they run like every 100 years, and you look at that and you're like, wow, that's not a big deal. They're kind of scrappy looking. They're big talus piles rising up out of the desert. And they're definitely dramatic, but definitely kind of scrappy at the same time, right? Wouldn't you agree? Then you get around on the backside and you're like, holy shit, this is like glacially carved, incredible mountains with huge vertical relief. Mount Tukanikavot's there, 12,400 feet. Little Tuk over here, you can see this avalanche right here. This is one of our biggest running slide paths, most frequent running and largest slide paths in the range. You can see the crown up there on the shoulder. It's a really dramatic, beautiful mountain range on the other side, especially when it has snow. And the other thing that you probably want to notice from these slides is that there isn't a lot of moderate terrain. And that is a problem for us. Everything is very steep and very big. Otherwise, it's very flat and very wooded. So it's kind of like go big or go home. And we spend a lot of time there just walking around wishing we could ski some of these big, beautiful giant lines, but we can't. this face here. Everything has very convex. This is the classic LaSalle feature, super convex terrain. It's not like walking along the ridge between Little Cottonwood and Big Cottonwood where you can just like kick cornices off and do ski cuts and tests. Here you've got to like get way down the slope to test it. And by the time you're that far down the slope, you're kind of beyond the point of no return. So it's definitely a sketchy, tricky place. And the terrain, along with the combination of our typically weak, shallow snowpack, how does that look to you guys? You guys ever see anything looking like that? Basically air underneath the slab. So that, accompanied by the winds, that we often get pretty strong, serious winds as the only island out there in the middle of the desert, produces very large avalanches. And this is a classic situation. Here's like a 6-foot crown. And then on the adjacent slope that's been scoured, there's not even any snow at all. We get some pretty big avalanche cycles almost every year. This year, we've got a classic persistent weak layer, but we just have not had much of a load yet. But we call this shot Old Reliable. And the crown here extends all the way back up to here, which is about 2,000 feet. This is on the ridge into Horse Creek, so it's a fairly significant slide path. And I've actually triggered this thing remotely just walking along the ridge. And then all of a sudden you feel a collapse and you've triggered a 2,000-foot wide avalanche with a 6-foot more crown. We also get some human-triggered avalanches, 2,000 feet wide here. That was on that Noriega's face. I think I showed you a picture of that slide a little earlier. And if you look over here on the ridge, on this right-hand side, you can see some ski tracks. These are some Moab locals that I know really well. They knew of the danger. This was 2019. We had a ton of snow that winter on top of a really bad persistent weak layer. So they were skiing this low-angle terrain over here on the right, and it was kind of Looker's right, and it was kind of a milk bottle sort of day, and they felt the collapse, and they creeped over to the edge, and they saw this triangle piece right here and figured they had triggered a small avalanche. And I went in there the next day, and a friend of mine flew over in a plane and took this shot aerial from the air, and they had triggered that entire face just from skiing that low-angle terrain up there on the ridge. Last year, my boss from the Forest Service, Brian Murdoch, Recreation Program Manager, this was in February after a big storm. We'd actually had a natural cycle like 3 days before this, and then a little bit of wind had blown in and covered up some of the debris. And we were skinning into Gold Basin down below here, and all of a sudden we came upon this giant pile of debris. And I kept trying to convince myself that this was a natural avalanche that had happened 3 days ago. And then I was looking around at all the other natural avalanches in the basin that had been slightly covered up or blown in. And I'm like, no, this thing just happened. And this is a sunny, windless day. This is not a natural. And so I'm like, we got to do a beacon search. And this thing is massive. I mean, you can see, right? I was able to contact Scott Soleil, who used to be an Alpha Patroller. He's now the commander of the Winter Rescue Team down there. And I contacted him on a spot device, or an inReach, and he was actually able to connect with Classic Helicopters, who's always willing to do a flyover down there for a search and rescue. And he jumped in with them, and he flew around because we couldn't see if there were tracks in from the top or anything like that. And he flew around, and he found out there were tracks on the ridge where somebody had skinned up from the other side, and they'd gone to the ridge, and then they'd turned around and gone back down. And it turns out they remoted this thing from the ridge. And actually, if we had been in there an hour earlier, you know, we could have been totally buried by that thing. So the place it's fairly sketchy. The history of the LaSalle Avalanche Forecast Center goes back to 1988. And this guy over here, Mark Yates, was the first forecaster in the LaSalle Mountains. And it was kind of all, back then it was known as the LaSalle Avalanche Forecast Center. And the whole idea for starting a forecast center down there actually came from tourism, like it or not. Moab was just making the shift from a ghost town uranium mining economy to the tourist economy that we all know that they have now. And they wanted to promote year-round recreation. They thought the LaSalles would be a thing. They were a group of pioneering backcountry skiers that had come from ski towns and had done other things, or they were mountaineers and they really wanted to get up. They were exploring the mountain range and they're like, this place has potential. This place is really cool. So they worked with the Moab Area Travel Council and they said, hey, if you guys will promote winter recreational LaSalle's, and if you will plow the road to the Geyser Pass Winter Trailhead, which is actually at 9,600 feet, it's a dirt road for the last 4 miles. It's the highest plowed winter trailhead in Utah. If you guys will plow the road and promote winter recreation here, we've got this other guy who's willing to put some huts up here, and will the Forest Service provide avalanche forecasting for the area? And the Forest Service didn't really even know where to start doing that. And Mark Yates had some background in avalanches. He was an outward bound instructor. He had taught ski mountaineering classes. He had taught some avalanche courses over in the San Juan Mountains, but he had never worked as a ski patroller. He had never been a professional in any capacity for forecasting, but he went to the Forest Service and he was game, and he convinced them to hire him as a independent contractor. He was not a Forest Service employee. He was an independent contractor to issue forecasts for the LaSalle Mountains starting in 1988. The Utah Avalanche Center was pretty small at the time. They had a 3-person staff up here in the Salt Lake office. They had Bruce Tremper, Brad Micklejohn, and I think, what was his name? I'm sorry, his name. He ended up becoming a snow ranger for the Forest Service. But there were 3 people on staff there. Brad Micklejohn and Bruce Tremper were the main ones. They thought, okay, this guy doesn't have all the qualifications, but some information coming from Moab is better than no information coming from Moab. So they brought him up to Salt Lake. They kind of gave him a crash course. He went out in the field with forecasters up here and did field work. They got him on routes. They sent him on the snowbird ski patrol, I believe it was, so he could go out and do that. Then they kind of turned him loose, and then they would go down there and get out in the field with him. And they mentored him in the best way that they could. And Mark got really excited about it. Here's his handwritten notes when we used to take observations this way. He set up this weather station, which we've now moved up to a much higher location. But he was super keen, and he had a young wife, and he had 2 young babies, and they had built a cabin on 10 acres of land on Wilson Mesa, which is kind of halfway between the mountains and the desert. And they were living the dream, man. It was paradise in Moab. And this is the way things looked back then. I mean, look at this gear and the way people are skiing. It was the late 80s. And these guys were pioneering a new mountain range. They were like, this is awesome. The first winter ascents of Mount Tukanikavats. You can see the desert out there. The first ski descents of Mount Tukanikavats. And look at these skis right here. I mean, these guys were getting it done. And it was quite an exciting time down there. The first yurts went in over by LaSalle Pass from Global Expeditions. This is Mount Peel, the highest peak in the range, 12.7. This big southeast face, incidentally, is a great corn run when it's in. People were coming down and staying in the yurts, and everything was looking good. They were having a great time, and things were rolling for Moab. And then on February 12th, 1992, a tragedy in the worst sense of the word happened. Mark Yates and 3 other people were caught, buried, and killed in an avalanche, along with 2 other survivors. A party of 6 went into the mountains that day. Mark Yates, Maribel Loveridge, Jeremy Hopkins, and Bill Turk were all killed in the avalanche. These were all good friends, but they were also accompanying Mark to do field work, ostensibly. And 2 guys survived, Steve Molesky and Craig Bigler. And I immediately sought out these guys when I went down to start forecasting down there, because I knew what had happened. I wanted to learn everything that I could about the range and the snowpack. I was a young ski patroller at Alta when this happened, and the shock waves through the community were intense. It wasn't just, they're all tragedies, but it wasn't just a recreational tragedy. This affected our industry now too, right? We've got a professional that was out there doing his job and had been caught in an avalanche, and other people were killed as well. The town was completely shaken. The industry was shaken. The Utah Avalanche Center was shaken. Suddenly, Bruce Tremper was actually over in Japan at the time, and we didn't have cell phones, and we didn't have the internet, and he actually didn't even know about the accident until he came home and got off the airplane at the airport, and he was told there. Brad Micklejohn, who had been holding down the fort for the Salt Lake office, had to write the avalanche forecast for Moab the next morning and report the accident. And then he had to jump in a car and drive down to Moab to oversee the recovery operations. And Brad knew Mark very well. He had taught avalanche classes to Steve Molesky and Jeremy Hopkins, who were both involved in the accident. And it was a big deal, to say the least. This is a photograph taken by Brad Micklejohn of the accident site, which is basically right in here. We'll get into that a little bit more. But I just want to briefly talk about the weather up to that accident. It's not unlike what we have going this year, but they had a lot of snow in November throughout the West. Deep, strong, stable snowpack. Early November into December. This is throughout the West. Then a giant high-pressure ridge built over the entire region. The LaSalle's went 31 days without any snowfall. We've actually almost done that this year. 31 days without snowfall, as did other ranges throughout the West. Snowpacks throughout the Intermountain West were faceting right through to the ground. Depths in the LaSalle's ranged from 38 inches to 48 inches, and most of that was completely faceted, interspersed with some wind crusts and some wind slabs up in the high country. Then on February 7th, the night of February 7th, it started snowing. And this is the snowfall between February 7th and the 12th. And these are not insane numbers. And so I know that you guys have a deeper intermountain snowpack, and that some years the backside of Ben Lomond there can get as much snow as Alta, but you've also had plenty of years with a weak, faceted, shallow snowpack. So here we have 4 inches of snow the night of the 7th into the 8th, 1 inch of snow on the 9th, 2 inches of snow on the 10th, 1.5 inches of snow on the 11th, and then 2 inches on the 12th, the day that they went into the mountains. These are, These are the handwritten water amounts taken by Brad Micklejohn. This is 1 inch of water over 6 days. 6 days. That is not a lot, right? Like if you were in Little Cottonwood Canyon on a normal snowpack, if you got that overnight, you wouldn't even really be particularly concerned. I mean, you'd have some new snow problems probably, but this is not earth-shattering water numbers. And this is a photocopy of Mark's last forecast. He nevertheless was aware of the dangers. It was pretty chilling. We used to just hand type these things, and then you'd read them over the phone, put them on an answering machine, and then you'd call up and you'd get the message. But this was in our file cabinet, and when you read through it, it's pretty chilling. They used to issue the forecast the afternoon before. So Mark issued this forecast on February 11th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The next day was the 12th that they went out. And these are the things that he said stuck out to him. Conditions are deteriorating steadily as we steadily load our predominantly weak snowpack. At present, the main problem are the winds, which are transporting our new snow onto leeward slopes. These loaded pockets now have a moderate potential for human-triggered slides on slopes steeper than 30 degrees. Right near the ridge lines, expect the danger to be high on slopes steeper than 35 degrees. And back in those days, we only had a 3-tier rating. It was low, moderate, and high. So he's calling for moderate danger with loading, tree line near and up near the ridges and above tree line, a high danger. Again, they were a party of 6, and their tour started out like most tours do in the LaSalle Mountains, driving up the sometimes plowed dirt road to the Geyser Pass Winter Trailhead right here. That's the blue line. And the plow crews down there do a great job, but they have other priorities first. And sometimes you're chaining up and driving through a foot of snow and rallying to get up there. And you get to the parking lot right here and you skin up. And then you go up this route that we call the Laurel Highway. And the Laurel Highway takes a little shortcut between the road cuts here. And then it goes up that ridge to just above tree line. You break out above tree line, and you continue on up that ridge to our weather station, our wind station at Pre-Laurel Peak at 11,700 feet. the party regrouped on the top of Pre Laurel Peak and discussed what they were going to do. And the weather was clearing off, and it was sunny, and it was beautiful, and they had fresh snow, and everybody was jonesing because they had gone 30 days without skiing any powder. And they are looking over at the bowls of Talking Mountain Cirque and the north-facing terrain that they knew was dangerous, but it looks beautiful. Their initial plan was to ski this south-facing run down into Gold Basin. It's a run known as Gold Miners, and it is south-facing, so it has a different snowpack. It also barely gets to 34 degrees at its steepest point, so it's kind of a go-to run for us when south faces are not cooked. And they were going to ski that run and get down into Gold Basin and reassess. And Mark was fairly convinced that they could go over, across, and up onto the north-facing slopes of Talking Mountain Cirque, but stop and turn around when it got too steep, and they wouldn't endanger themselves. And he said, we want to go look at that north-facing terrain. We want to dig some snow pits, and we could probably get some good powder on the lower angle slopes down there in the bottom. Jeremy Hopkins and Steve Molesky were dead set against it at first. They had been out skiing the day before. They had observed collapsing. They had seen small avalanches on road cuts and test slopes. They had also just taken a class with Brad Micklejohn up in Salt Lake, and they were not into it. But they talked about it, and they said, okay, let's just ski down, get to the bottom, and reassess. So they skied that beautiful south-facing run that we call Gold Miners, because there is a Gold Miners cabin off in the woods over there. They skied this beautiful south-facing run down into the flats here where they gathered for lunch. And they talked about it some more. And it's a classic case of human dynamics. Part of the thing is there's the expert halo going on, right? Mark's the forecaster, and everybody is out there with Mark, and they're kind of looking to him. Part of the group is Steve and Jeremy are still not so psyched about it. Marbell, Bill, and Craig are kind of in the middle, not really voicing their opinions or not necessarily sure if they even have one. Mark says, hey, let's just go across the flats here and see if we feel any more collapsing and work our way up, because we can definitely go up into here where it's low angle, and we can stop and turn around at any time. So they agreed to keep going across and turn around as soon as they didn't feel good about it. And Steve Molesky, who was actually in the lead and survived the avalanche, did say, you know, we moved our way across there. We didn't get any more collapsing, and we actually started feeling solid snow underneath with the pole plants, and so it felt pretty good to us. And he actually started feeling better about things as they got closer to the slope. So after reskinning, they made the decision to ascend the slopes up into Talking Mountain Cirque here. They did discuss their plans and their route, and they agreed that they were going to stay on the lower angle slopes. You actually can ascend up here pretty far without getting above 20, 25 degrees. They got to this little mound up here where the sun is shining below the pass, decided to ascend just a little bit higher, and that's where the angle backs up into the 30-degree range. Steve Molesky was in the lead, and they were all pretty much in a line, and they took a pattern to the left and headed towards that rock outcropping, and that's when they felt the collapse. They turned and looked at each other, and everyone confirmed they had heard it. They turned around and looked back up and saw an avalanche coming down on them, subsequently triggering another avalanche. And basically one started right at the pass there, and another one came down from these rocks over on the left, and the two slides converged and buried all 6 participants in the party. When dust cleared, so to speak, Steve Molesky found himself near the surface or partially unburied, and he was able to extricate himself from the debris and quickly look around and didn't see anything on the surface of the snow. He pulled out his beacon, did a quick beacon search, and dug up Mark Yates within 10, 15 minutes and found him unresponsive with no pulse and no breathing, and immediately began CPR. He was doing CPR for several minutes when he heard a noise or looked down slope and saw another figure partially visible on the surface. He left Mark and skied down and found Craig Bigler trying to dig himself out. Steve helped Craig extricate himself. They pulled out their beacons, continued to search, and found the rest of the party members all expired.
After digging up all the victims, night was quickly approaching and they found themselves in a very dire situation. This place was a lot more remote than it was back those days, and they skied out as the sun was setting and darkness was falling. They had to drive back down into Moab, got there well after dark, and reported what had happened to the Grand County Sheriff. They started assembling a rescue team. A storm moved back in, created more dangerous avalanche conditions, put down several more inches or up to a foot of new snow. They had to do avalanche mitigation efforts to make the place safe for rescuers to come in, and it took several days to come back in and recover the bodies of the victims. It was a really tragic incident, like they all are, but it very much haunted the community of Moab for years and years to come, and it still affects people that live here today.
So this diagram here shows the approximate location of the party as they were heading up into the slopes of Talking Mountain Cirque. And, you know, at first glance, it looks like they're heading right into a death trap there. But what you have to realize is they're in a line right here. So this is a 20-degree slope. They haven't made a switchback yet. And they're heading up these lower angle slopes. And honestly, even talking to Brad Micklejohn, who did the official report and who I talked to extensively after the fact, it wasn't fully understood back then how collapsing could communicate up a slope and that you could remotely trigger an avalanche, right? We knew about weak layers, we knew about slabs, but it still wasn't, they were convinced that as long as they didn't get up there in the starting zones near the ridge crests, that they were going to be okay and they were going to stay on the lower angle terrain. And they got to right here. So Steve Molesky's in the lead, and there's Mark Yates, number 2. And that was the first switchback that they threw in. They started making a switchback up toward these rocks, and that's when they felt the collapse. Steve Molesky, now this is compounded by the fact that they all have skins on, right? Because you're in uphill mode of travel, so you cannot escape this thing fast. Steve and Craig Bigler, these were the 2 survivors, number 1 and number 6. This is the avalanche that came down first. The party here all tried to escape to this side. Steve was able to get off to the fringe on this side. They were all brought down and buried, but somehow Steve and Craig did not get completely buried. And I think about these guys because nowadays we have in-reach devices and we have cell phones. And I mean, these guys had no communication, right? And they have just endured one of the most traumatic things you ever can, and they've dug up all of their dead friends, and now they've got to ski out in the dark. And I can't even imagine what that car ride, it's 45 minutes back down to Moab, you know, a dirt road and then the pavement, and then you've just basically got to drive to the or was the sheriff's office closed and they had to go to the nearest payphone? You guys remember those? We used to have payphones down there, you know. I mean, these guys literally had to do that before they could tell somebody about it. And then the rescue effort started getting assembled. This is Brad Micklejohn with the Forest Service patch on over here. But then another storm came in and they had to bring in a helicopter to do avalanche mitigation. They weren't able to go in there the first day. They finally went in there the next day and started doing the very, very grim work. And I've only been on a couple of these, but for anybody that's ever been on this, it's a really, really grim process. And it was made all the more challenging by the fact that, you know, they didn't have beacons that you can flag, you know, multiple victims with like we have nowadays. And you had a little peeps. You had this thing in your ear and you walked around and it beeped. And it was a really slow beep and it got louder the closer you got, and then it got quieter, and then you had to turn around and you had to go back and you had to pay really close attention to what you're doing. It took a lot of effort to work with these. And then when you dug someone up, you turned it off so that it wouldn't interfere with your search when you were looking for the next victims. So they turned everyone's beacons off except for Marabel's, who they dug up last. And then they got the hell out of there. And now it snowed another foot, and avalanche mitigation brought down more slides to bury the victims further. And now they don't have any beacons on. So they're in there probing and basically looking for needles in a haystack. They with the dog, and they did recover Marabel and Bill, Marabel and Jeremy the first day. Then the last day they were racing against the clock because another storm was coming in, and they managed to find, gosh, I had to quit using my hands so much because I knock stuff around. They managed to find Jeremy, and then Mark was the last person they found. And this is the hole that Mark was found in. And look how deep that is. And Brad Micklejohn's face says it all. I spoke to Brad, again, like I said, extensively, and he said that it was the worst day of his life. And he actually gave up avalanche forecasting entirely after this. The impacts to the town were devastating. Like I said, it's a really small town. You didn't have to go and they weren't a ski town or a mountain town either. So you've got like, you know, Grandma Holyoke that's been there since the uranium industry, and they don't go to the mountains in the wintertime, and all of a sudden they know so-and-so who died of an avalanche, you know, and they had a memorial at the Moab City Park that over 300 people attended about a week or so later. So just to drive the point home, these are devastating events, and the ripple effects are wide and broad. So when you're out there skiing and touring around, just keep in mind, I mean, if you die, you're dead, but the effects go far and wide. In 2012, to fast forward many years, actually, I should back up 1 second. So a few findings came out of that accident, and I don't want to go into that too much. I talked about it at ProSaw, and it's more for operational purposes. But several findings came out of that and things that led up to that happening. And it was even considered that the LaSalle Avalanche Forecast Center gets shut down. Funding was always in question down there to begin with. It's a remote, faraway place. Was there enough user base, et cetera, et cetera? I think you guys have experienced similar thoughts maybe up here in the Ogden zone, or at least heard that from the organization. It was determined that they want to keep forecasting going down there. They recommended that the Forest Service hire forecasters directly and that they are Forest Service employees. If anybody is hired that's not a Forest Service employee, they need to be under the supervision of a Forest Service employee. And that's not because the Forest Service is so much more qualified, but because they have more standards and it protects them more to make sure that they're covering their bases, right? And so now I actually have an employee down there that's helping me out. This is great. Dave Garcia, and he's been putting in observations for years. And he is an employee of the nonprofit, but he functions under my supervision from the Forest Service. And he's sending observations to me for years, and he's great. And that was one of the recommendations that came out of this, was that there needs to be 2 people down there. And it took years of off and on to make that sort of thing happen. And other guidelines were established in terms of protocol and whatnot. But the main thing is the LaSalle Avalanche Forecast Center, as it was always known then, continued to limp along and provide information. And then in 2012, we had another accident on the backside of the range. Some snowmobilers came in from Colorado, and this slide path doesn't do it justice, but it's a south-facing exposure, but there's some southeast on this flank, and there's a road that runs underneath it. And a group of snowmobilers, without even thinking about what's above them, went in underneath, a party of, I think, 4. And the party that went through triggered the avalanche remotely, and the last person that went underneath got caught by it. And he was a young man. That's another picture of the slide that broke down. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, it doesn't show the full length of the path, the road under it. But it caught a young man, and he was completely buried down in this terrain trap, down in a ravine in the bottom. Grand County Search and Rescue was called out, as well as the Grand County Winter Rescue Team, which is a sub-unit that we have down there, because Grand County is a really great, they're good at rescuing stranded side-by-sides and rock climbers and base jumpers that splat, but they're not like completely winter equipped, right? And so as part of the accident that happened in 1992, a bunch of the local backcountry skiers formed what was called the Winter Rescue Team. And we meet once a month throughout the winter and have a winter training. And so a lot of times if the main team can only make it in so far and provide operation support, the Winter Rescue Team members will go in and pull off the rest of the mission. But this was another pretty tragic one with a very, very deep burial. You can see the size of the hole down there in the bottom. In 2016, this is the classic. You saw this slide path earlier. It's a way frequent runner. It's gravel pit lanes, we call this thing. It's actually named after the bowling alley down in Moab, which is by the gravel pit, because those are some bowling alley lanes up on top. This is what we call Little Took or Took. No, Took is over here on the left. And this was in March, And we actually had a relatively stable snowpack. People had been getting away with skiing off the summit of Tuke for days. Wind slabs were our primary concern. They were usually quite identifiable. But this is a repeat running slide path, and this nasty little pocket in the middle just never fills in. It always has facets, it always has rocks, and it's the crux, right? You can ski the glory at the top, and you always have to deal with this at the bottom. And this party skied in off the top. They triggered an avalanche right there. Pretty small slide, but it all funneled together in the gully, and it carried him down to here. And I actually got the call because I knew the guy personally. And then I had to alert search and rescue and go out with them. These are pictures from the investigation the day after, but you can see it's barely even an 8 to 12-inch crown in a really small pocket, but it scraped him right over the rocks, took him for a ride right down through the gully. And we get the call from him personally, and he's injured his knee. And we've got to go in and help out. So we go in there and we go to the end of the Gold Basin Road, and we've got a sked. You guys know what a sked is? It's, like a roll-up toboggan that we're ready to carry in there. And we're like skiing in to rescue these guys. And this party comes out and they're like, hey, there's a rescue going on in there. And we're like, yeah, we know that's what we're doing. We're here to rescue these guys. And they're like, no, they've already got a sled. And we're like, wow, really? And we do have a sled stationed. If you remember, you go back to that slide where I showed the Laurel Ridge going up and you got right above tree line there. We actually have a sled stationed up there, a toboggan. But it is across the basin on another slope, way up high up there. You'd have to ski down 1,800 feet with it and carry it up to these guys to get to them. And I'm thinking, how would they have ever got that sled? But sure enough, we arrive, and there he is in that sled. And what they had done is first they built a sled out of skis to get the guy off the debris. They're very resourceful. They did this themselves. So take note of that package they've put together there. They bring him down off the debris, and then lo and behold, these guys who have never been to the La Salle Mountains ever before are staying in the Gold Basin yurt. This guy's on a split board. Actually, he wasn't even on a split board. He had snowshoes, a snowboarder with snowshoes. They get up the Laurel Ridge, and they look across, and they see this avalanche accident in progress. And then they glance over their shoulder and see this toboggan that we have strapped to the trees. And this kid says, I bet they can use that. And literally, he takes the thing down, and then we've got this big run called the funnel. I think I might be able to show you a picture of it later. I mean, it's a 1,400 to 1,600 foot vertical run, this bowl that goes down into this chute, and he's never even been down it before. And he grabs this toboggan on his snowboard, and he takes it all the way down into the basin, puts on his snowshoes, and drags the toboggan up to them. And by the time we arrive, I mean, they're already on. We go in a quarter mile and we find these guys. They were 100% almost self-sufficient, other than the fact that at the end of the road, they get on it's a packed road, another 2 miles. They do get extricated that way. But these guys had fully been self-sufficient and then been rescued by another party that happened to be out there. It was amazing. A week later, we got another 8 to 10 inches of snow. Same thing filled back in. This guy was a little bit more savvy. He got to the crux roll over there and didn't like it. He did not just launch off it blindly into it. He put a ski cut across the top of it, and he released it again. Then in 2019, one of the biggest things I've ever been involved in happened. And that was the year, I think I was telling you, we had a super bad week later because it was dry all of December. But then it started snowing, and it did not stop. It did not stop until the end of April. It was still snowing. I was over it, I hate to say. I mean, it snowed so much that winter, but it was so dangerous you could not get on anything steep. And that's when I learned how to ride a snowmobile. Because you could go out there and you could get powder and you could carve around and have a great time without ever getting on a slope. Because like I said, the bottom line is we don't have slopes in the 25 to 30 degree range. We have slopes that are 15 to 20 degrees or 35 to 50 degrees. So snowmobile was really fun that winter. These guys were out snowmobiling, and they took it a little bit too far. And in fact, one guy actually snowmobiled all the way up to that saddle up there, and the rest of the crew started trying to follow him in various degrees. And then this thing got triggered and caught one guy and carried him down. And I got the call about 7 o'clock at night, and classic helicopters had done a flyover, but it was getting dark, and they sent some pictures of the debris, and there was nothing that we could do until the next day. Essentially, this is the position of the party members when it all happened. And one guy made it all the way up, and these guys were messing around over here, and the two dads didn't really like what was going on, and they hung out back here. Somehow these guys got out of it. 2 and 3 rode out of it, and number 4 didn't even know it was hitting him because he was riding straight up that slope when the thing came down on top of him. And the next morning, myself, Scott Soleil, who I mentioned is the winter commander down there for SAR, and Jonathan Morgan, who's the snow safety director at Alta, they came down. They've been a big help. I can't stress how much the professional ski patrols and Wasatch Backcountry Rescue and these guys really do. And ski areas, you know, we're backcountry skiers. Maybe in some ways we don't like to see big ski resorts out there and whatnot. But at the end of the day, those ski area professionals are the ones that are going to be out there the quickest, and they are going to save your ass. And this is what it looked like flying over that morning. And we flew through that saddle, and we didn't know exactly what we were going to be looking at. And my mind was blown when I saw the scale of this avalanche we were dealing with. And as we were flying out, we were trying to decide, our main thing was, do we need avalanche mitigation before we can conduct a rescue? Or can we get a hasty team in here and fly them and land them right on the debris and just get this dealt with? And there's been a lot of talk and second guessing ever since this accident happened about that. But the bottom line is, San Juan County was organizing a rescue, and these folks were rallying to come in there and save and or dig up their dead community member. And some of these guys, most of them didn't have avalanche beacons. Some of them were wearing Carhartts. I mean, this was a scene that was a little bit hard to get control of. And we were afraid that if we had, you know, all of these folks just heading in there, I knew that any slope somebody happened onto was going to go. And if we could keep them tightly controlled, that probably wouldn't happen. But we weren't sure we were going to be able to keep this thing tightly controlled, because literally we had a checker, you know, where you're supposed to sign people in and make sure they have a beacon and everything. And there were people riding right past them. And so as we were flying out and we saw a variety of natural avalanches throughout the range, each of us in our own minds came to the conclusion that, no, we need to do some mitigation here. And then we talked about it when we landed. And so it took quite a while, because all the search and rescue team is massed and they want to go in there. And it's still pretty far to get in there. From where the command post was, you've got to drive another 15 miles, some of it snowpacked dirt road. Then you got to get on a snowmobile and go in another 5 miles before you're even at the base of this thing. So it was logistically a big deal. It took a long time to get the explosives and the helicopter lined up to come down and do it. People were waiting, people were getting nervous, people were impatient. But at the end of the day, and maybe you guys have seen this before because this made quite the rounds, but at the end of the day, this is what happened as a result of our mitigation efforts.
They're clearing that hillside.
Holy cow.
Jesus. Listen to that thing.
John, you got a big one coming at you. I'm sure you do it.
They'll never make it up on top of this hill.
No. Well, I guess they only needed one shot.
That's how sensitive things are in LaSalle's.
Holy shit.
And so at the end of the day, that debris did not actually run over the accident site, but we just weren't comfortable turning people loose in there. We just didn't know, because I knew how sensitive things were, and it just seemed like it was a little bit of a risky situation. So then after the mitigation was done, teams were brought in. It was getting pretty late in the afternoon. We had a false signal way high up here on the slope. A dog alerted, as well as DPS flew over with their transponder that they hang from a long line there, and they picked up a false signal. So we spent a considerable amount of time really trying to probe this area. But at the end of the day, he ended up where they pretty much always end up, and it was all the way down here at the very bottom of the toe of the avalanche. But we thought, since this was his last point seen, there is a little bit of a terrain feature right here that debris can pile up, and that's where the false alert happened. We thought that it was worth spending some time up here. But at the end of the day, thanks to Lauren and her avalanche dog from Park City, who I can't remember the dog's name, they found him before dark, and that was the end of that day. And that was another pretty, I mean, they're all a big deal. And San Juan, we've been trying to spread the message to snowmobiling community for a long time, and they're really cluing in a lot. And it's really exciting to see, especially over the last 10, 15 years. The further you get out, you know, the less they've accepted it or learned it yet, you know. And unfortunately, I had met members of this party at the trailhead a week before down in the Abajos. And I tried to communicate to them how dangerous, unusually dangerous conditions were this year. And they were like, yeah, you know, we've been here for 30 years. We know this. And you hear that a lot. We've been here a long time. We've done this for a long time. And the local knowledge. And sometimes it really means a lot. And sometimes they just don't get everything that's going on. And unfortunately, this time they didn't. The good thing that came out of it is we got the whole entire Monticello snowmobiling community together after that, and we held it at a guy's farmhouse. It was really awesome. We went down to his shop where he had a farm outside of Monticello, and we gave an avalanche class to 25 guys, and we all went out in the field after that, and it was, you know, sometimes that's what it takes, unfortunately. A couple weeks later, things were still really sensitive. Snowmobile triggered this avalanche from the ridge. They actually were being very safe. They were up on the ridge and remote triggered this slide. A few weeks after that, some folks from the Wasatch were down staying at the yurts. They triggered this avalanche. The guy took a ride and got partially buried. And then finally, in March of that year, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I missed the biggest avalanche cycle that the LaSalles have seen during my career, because I was in Hawaii with my girlfriend and her family. And Mark Staples came down for it, and this is Dave Garcia in the foreground, who's my assistant down there now. And we had 36 inches of snow and a little over 3 inches of water in, I think, 30 hours or so, and it finally brought the house down. Widespread, massive avalanche cycle. This is that same avalanche path I showed you earlier, only this time it's much deeper. Horse Creek, we call this Old Reliable. You can see the crown goes all the way back to there. It's 2,000 feet wide. And then these front slopes that, what did I say, only avalanche every 100 years or so? You see that bald patch up there? Oh, kind of right about there. Well, that's this. And that thing avalanched. And this is what it did. My boss from the Forest Service and I went in there in the springtime, took some ATVs up the LaSalle Pass Road, and then hiked into here and took some tree samples. And these trees were, I mean, aspens are hard to core, but we did aspens and some firs, and these trees were anywhere from 65 to 90 years old or more. So this seems like it was a 100-year event. It took out that entire stand of trees there. And so you can still see that when you go up there. Now, the good thing that came out of this is now it's late March, and we've got a super deep snowpack, and everything has avalanched, and we're finally feeling good about conditions. And this photo was not taken that year, but I want to show you this line. This is the northwest face of Mount Tukanikavats. It rarely fills in. In fact, even in this photograph, the spot in the middle is rock and ice. Oh, about 5 years ago, or maybe a little longer, TGR came and did a film here, and they rappelled through it. They skied it and they wrapped through it right there. I'd only heard of a couple other people skiing that ever before, actually only one other person. And now everything had run and everything was pretty dang stable and everything was like super fat. And then it snowed like 8 inches without any wind. And I was up in the cirque one day and I looked up at that line and I was like, oh my God, it's in. It's in. What am I going to do about this? Right? So I got a friend and we rallied up there and got to ski off the top. And this doesn't make it look very dramatic, but it's a very big face and it all goes down to that very small choke. And you feel really, really small up there. And it was clean all the way through. And we managed to send that line. And I've waited like 25 years for that. Like that's literally how it is in LaSalle's. You know, I've been trying to tick off lines, north faces over the years, and sometimes they don't even happen at all. And some lines you just wait forever for, and that is one of those that you wait forever for, and it came through. The most classic line on Tuke, which I want to make sure it's Tuke because a lot of people call it Tuck, and it's Mount Tukenikavats. And now we've got this thing going on called Tuke season because it was in the 50 Classics. You guys know about the 50 Classics book, right? So Mount Tukenikavats is now one of the 50 Classics, and sometimes it can be a little out of hand down there. I had never seen anything like this before, but this is the face that most people ski, and it's usually from late March into mid-April that, holy cow, I had a video of my boss and I driving up to the parking lot, and the cars were lined up all the way down the road. In the springtime, my boss is like, we've got a spruces situation here. You guys know. So, I mean, the parking lot was that packed. So this is what Tuke can look like some years. But if they're really, but the thing about the 50 Classics book is it says Mount Tukenikavats has a classic line, but it doesn't say which line. It just shows a photograph of the peak. And the truth be told, this is the real classic line off Mount Tukenikavats. It's called Tukler Reaction. It's a southwest facing 3,500 foot corn run. I've done it a couple of times. It doesn't get done a lot because it basically puts you down in the middle of nowhere. In fact, I think Corey was there working the Pack Creek fire, right, Corey? And so you end up down at the bottom of this line and you are nowhere. And so sometimes you got to figure out some way to get back. And the classic way we used to do it back in the old days is we'd leave a car down at Pack Creek and then we'd go around and all the way up and we'd climb it and ski it. And then you carry some flip-flops in your pack and you walk out the Pack Creek Road until you hit the dirt. And then you put your flip-flops on and then you have to get to your car and drive all the way back around. But that's the classic Tukler reaction line off Mount Tukenikavats. And finally, there are plenty of other things to ski in the range when things are happening. But I need to stress that things aren't often happening. They're not happening right now, as a matter of fact. And not so much because they're dangerous. It's just we don't have enough snow and it's all been wind wrecked. But a lot of times when we do have a lot of snow, it's still very dangerous. Days like this are far and few between. But man, when they come in, you definitely take advantage of it. And it's a really cool, dramatic, beautiful range with some big, proud lines. But you've got to be patient, and you can't think it's really going to happen every day down there. And in fact, if you do go down there, just be psyched that you get to take a really cool tour up into some really high alpine peaks, and you get to see the desert below. And if something like this happens in March or even into April, you're really scoring. And then finally, I just want to bring it back to Mark, Marbell, Jeremy, and Bill. And not a single day goes by that I don't go out there in the field and think about these guys. And it's different for everyone and every place that you go. But every time that you go out there, you want to be thinking about that possibility. And I think everybody knows this. And that's why you guys are all a community here as part of the Ogden Avalanche Center. But it's real. And it's sometimes a very abstract concept. We understand this thing about avalanches, but I'll tell you, it became really real for me when I was cartwheeling and somersaulting and choking on snow and thinking I was going to die. And it really got real for these guys. So keep it safe out there. And that's all I got.
Any piece of man, I got